Any attempt to tell the story of Western philosophy must begin with the ancient Greeks, who produced not only the first, but some of the greatest Western philosophers. The one whose name is probably most familiar is Socrates, who died in the year 399 BC. But there were several outstanding Greek philosophers before him, some of whose names are also widely known. For example, Pythagoras and Heraclitus. There were others, too, of comparable caliber, the first one of all being Thales, who flourished in the 6th century BC. If all these pre-Socratic philosophers can be said to have had one common concern, it was an attempt to find universal principles which would explain the whole of nature. In today's terms, they were as much concerned with what we would call science as with what we would call philosophy. Now, Socrates was in conscious rebellion against their tradition. He maintained that what we most need to learn is not how nature works, but how we ourselves ought to live, and therefore that we need first and foremost to consider moral questions. Socrates didn't write anything. He did all his teaching by word of mouth, and none of the writings of any of the pre-Socratic philosophers have come down to us directly. So all that we know of any of the philosophers whose names I've mentioned so far is what has come down to us second-hand, through the writings of others, though this does include some pretty long summaries and a good many direct quotations. The first philosopher who wrote works which we actually now possess complete was Plato. He was a pupil of Socrates, and in fact it's from Plato's writings that most of our knowledge of Socrates derives. In his own right, however, Plato was, beyond any question, one of the greatest philosophers of all time. Some think the greatest. So, if we have to choose an arbitrary starting point in what is, after all, a continuous story, then in many ways a good one is the year 399 BC, with the death of Socrates and then the subsequent writings of Plato. Plato was about 31 when Socrates died and lived to be 81. During that half-century, he founded his famous school in Athens, the Academy, which was the prototype of what we call a university, and he produced his writings, nearly all of which take the form of dialogues, with different arguments being put in the mouths of different characters, one of whom nearly always is Socrates. Most, though not all, of these dialogues are called by the name of one of the people Socrates is talking to in them. Thus, we have the Phaedo, the Laches, the Euthyphro, the Theaetetus, the Parmenides, the Timaeus, and so on. There are more than 24 of them, some of them 20, some 80, a couple of them 300 pages long. The most famous of all are probably the Republic and the Symposium, but most of them are easily available nowadays in paperback translations. The best are regarded as works of literature, great works of literature, as well as of philosophy. Plato was an artist as well as a thinker, and many people regard his prose as the finest Greek prose ever to have been written by anyone. With me now is one of the acknowledged experts on Plato in the English-speaking world, the Professor of Ancient Philosophy in the University of Cambridge, Miles Burnyeat. Professor Burnyeat, I know that you regard Plato's career as a creative philosopher as having been somehow launched by Socrates' death. How was that?
Well, I think Socrates' death in 399 must have been a traumatic event for a lot of people. Socrates had been this spellbinding presence around in Athens for many, many years, much loved, much hated. He'd been caricatured on the comic stage. Then suddenly this familiar figure's not there anymore, and he's not there because, must have been the most traumatic thing, he's been condemned to death on a charge of impiety and corrupting the young. Well, he'd had a lot of followers, and some of them, amongst them Plato, began writing Socratic dialogues, conversations, philosophical conversations in which Socrates takes the lead. It must have been like a chorus of voices saying to the Athenians, look, he's not gone after all, he's still here, still asking those awkward questions, still tripping you up with his arguments. And of course, they were also defending his reputation and showing he'd been unjustly condemned, he was the great educator of the young, not the great corrupter.
But the death of Socrates wasn't just, so to speak, a launching pad for Plato, was it? the whole of Plato's outlook can, in one sense, be explained with reference to Socrates, can it not?
I think it can. To keep alive the Socratic spirit for Plato meant to go on doing philosophy in the way Socrates had done. So what you get is a group of early dialogues in which he is basically showing Socrates discussing the sorts of questions he was interested in, very largely moral questions. But since to do philosophy in the Socratic way means to do it by thinking philosophically, the process, bit by bit and inevitably, leads Plato to develop his own ideas in a host of other areas, so that Socrates, there's a sort of evolution in the picture of Socrates. From the gadfly questioner of the early dialogues, he gradually turns into the man who's expounding political theories, metaphysical theories, and so on, in the middle period dialogues, Meno, Symposium, Phaedo, and Republic.
And I suppose also one can say that in the early dialogues, Plato is dealing with subjects that interested Socrates and dealing with them in Socrates' way, and is then carried, so to speak, by his own momentum as the years go by into dealing with subjects that interest him, Plato, and beginning to deal with them in a different way.
I think that's right. Wherever he can plausibly present the ideas as the outgrowth of thinking about Socrates' ideas, they get put in the mouth of Socrates. And I think it's very important that the way he presents Socrates, the historical claim he makes about him is, this is a man who thought for himself and taught others to think for themselves. So if you want to be a follower of Socrates, that means thinking for yourself and, if necessary, departing from ideas and areas that Socrates had marked out.
Now, those early dialogues where Socrates is dealing with moral questions all have a certain common pattern, don't they? I mean, what happens in nearly all of them is that Socrates is talking to some interlocutor who thinks he knows the meaning of some very familiar term like friendship or courage or piety or something of that kind. And by simply quizzing him, by interrogating him, by submitting him to what's become known as Socratic questioning, Socrates shows this person, and incidentally the onlookers as well, that they don't at all have a clear grasp of this concept that they thought they understood so well. Now, this process has itself been of enormous importance in philosophy ever since, hasn't it?
Not only has it been, but these very works are still very widely used to teach philosophy and to introduce philosophy to people who want to know something about it. You start with a familiar and important concept. It's always a concept that's important in our life, and you get people to realize that there are problems in that concept. They try to think about it, they produce an answer, Socrates shows the inadequacy of the answer. You end up not with a firm answer, but with a much better grasp of the problem than you had before, and you, the reader, 20th century reader or an ancient reader, are left both drawn into the problem and wanting to get the answer and feeling that perhaps you can contribute.
One can't help reflecting that even after more than 2,000 years, we are still puzzling about the meaning of terms like beauty or courage or friendship. We are still wondering precisely what these things consist of. Have we got any further after all this time?
Yes and no must be the answer, mustn't it? I think Plato would be very firmly insistent that even if he did know the answer, if he told us, it wouldn't do us any good. I mean, it's the nature of these questions that they are ones that you have to think about for yourself, and an answer is worth nothing unless it's come through your own thinking. And that's why these dialogues are so successful as instruments for drawing you into philosophy.